Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Denise Mananes. I'm the Assistant Vice President for External Affairs for St. John's Riverside Hospital, and I would like to welcome you all to our Sleepless Nights webinar. And we are planning a whole series of these webinars moving forward, and so please read your email that we send out. If you'd like to get email from us, let us know that in the chat section here online, and we'll be able to add you to our list. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my team, Jason Latour, who is our producer, Nancy Anabi, our community liaison, and Candace Cousins-Hopkins, our Associate Director of External Affairs. They are the team that produce these webinars for the community. Also, I'd like to talk about our partners in the community who help us get these webinars out. And the first one is Sally Pinto. She is from the Yonkers Neighborhood Naturally Occurring Retirement Community. That is under the umbrella of the Yonkers Office for the Aging and Westchester Jewish Community Services. Also, Z. Baird from the Yonkers Public Library. And they make this available to all the people who frequent the libraries at their three locations, the Riverfront, the Will Library, and Crestwood. Today, our topic on Sleepless Nights, we have a wonderful doctor on staff at St. John's by the name of Dr. Brijesh Malkani, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Malkani practices for the Mount Sinai Doctors of Westchester. He is dual board certified sleep neurologist. A firmly rooted New Yorker, he completed both medical school and neurology residency at NYU School of Medicine and NYU Medical Center. Thereafter, he completed a prestigious fellowship in sleep medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Malkani offers expertise in a wide array of neurologic conditions, from common back pain to complicated migraines, as well as management of a full spectrum of sleep disorders. So, Dr. Malkani, thank you very much for being with us today and giving us your valuable time. I'd like to start with some basic questions and maybe start by saying, everybody I talk to, including me, everybody's sleepless. Everybody's experiencing some kind of insomnia. I don't know whether it's stress related, whether it's COVID related, COVID stress related, whatever it is. I think this is a topic that's on everybody's mind, and I wanted to be able to present to the community some overview of sleep. So the first question I have: how do you know if you have a problem sleeping? So what are the symptoms that I should look for if I have a real problem and it's not just an occasional insomnia?
That's a great question, Denise. Thank you for having me. Hello to the community. I'm happy to be here, and it's my pleasure to give what insight I can. I know many of us, excuse me, have certainly been, excuse me, have certainly been having significant difficulty that hasn't just been recent, that has been ongoing. We've been in the midst of a pandemic for 2 years. Clearly, there are personal and family things that can keep us up at night. So certainly sleep is one of those conditions, and it's one of those areas in which it's highly vulnerable to disruption. And your question about what symptoms to look out for, it's highly variable. Someone can describe having just some difficulty falling asleep, but oftentimes there are people out there that are also having difficulty just staying asleep. And they may fall asleep right away, but through the course of the night have frequent awakenings, can't seem to go back to sleep, or they'll just wake up feeling excessively tired and not feeling well rested. And so there's a whole variety of symptoms that come into play. For some of us, there may be some snoring and breathing difficulties. Some of my patients complain about crampy legs or feeling like their legs are jerking at night. Some patients just say they need a nap during the day. They're not aware of any major issues at night, but they just don't feel rested, and they feel like they could take a long nap in the afternoon. There's patients that just have frequent urination at night, and so that's also a concern. So it's a very individual experience, and any of those symptoms that I just described may be relevant and may require further evaluation.
Okay, so that's very interesting, and I'm going to note what you said about taking naps because I want to ask you a question about that in a little bit. But is there such a thing as an average number of hours that people should be sleeping, or is that a very individual thing?
Yes, it's absolutely an individual thing. There is the idea that a typical middle-aged adult should get about 8 hours of sleep at night. But that it varies from person to person. There are what we call short sleepers who may only sleep 6 hours or 4 hours and still be incredibly functional during the next day. And then there are those that sleep 9 hours, 10 hours, and they're still tired the next day. So it is a highly variable experience, and for each their own, so to speak.
So I think that's part of what people are experiencing is this frustration that they have that they're still tired, no matter how much sleep they may as an individual need. Everybody I know comes in and goes, God, I'm tired. I slept 8 hours. I slept 7 hours. I'm tired. Why do you suppose that is? Is that a quality of sleep issue? What is that?
Assuming that they're getting enough quantity, and like we said, that depends on everyone's individual needs. But it certainly speaks to what we were discussing earlier, the stress in their life. That's playing such a significant role, that's weighing us down, all of the different changes we've had to go through in the last couple of years. Changes, then changes back, then changes back to what it was before. And we're all sort of at a, or many of us are at a point now where our wellness has been affected and we're having difficulties with this sort of new normal, the new way of life. And we're trying to figure it out for something that we never really dealt with in our lifetime. So you take that recent occurrence with the pandemic, but then the other stressors in our life never quite went away, right? There's still financial obligations, there's still childcare, there's still career requirements, there's still needs at home. And so when you compound all of these elements together, absolutely it can play a tremendous role, not just impacting our sleep at night, but even more impacting our day-to-day functioning.
Hmm.
So that's why sleep is so important to re-energize us, to clear out some of that waste that's accumulating during the day and in our brains, and just to give us the opportunity to hit the reset button for the next day.
So that talks very much about life stressors and things that weigh on our mind, but there are other issues that people should be looking out for that might tell them it's a different kind of an issue, like a sleep disorder. Can you address some of the most common things, the sleep disorders that folks have, and whether or not they're diagnosable and treatable, and what's involved with that?
Yes, absolutely. So when I see patients in the office, there's a variety of complaints that they may have. Some of it may be related to the difficulty of falling asleep or staying asleep. Some of it may be related to breathing issues. And so when we're dealing with patients that may have a breathing condition, we have to consider something like sleep apnea. So sleep apnea is a condition in which our airway, when we sleep at night, it collapses and leads to a blockage. Now, for all of us, our muscles are trying to rest. They're trying to relax at nighttime. So that by itself is fine. And even snoring is just a vibration of the vocal cord. So just because you snore doesn't mean you have considerable sleep apnea. However, if you have airway constriction that's occurring, blockages happening at nighttime that are causing pauses in your breathing, that are leading to fatigue the next day, that are leading you to wake up and feel that you didn't sleep at all, then that certainly requires further attention and may require getting a sleep study done so that we can investigate. We can see what's going on with the oxygen, what's going on with the breathing, what's happening with our heart rate when we sleep at night. Are the legs moving? And so St. John's has a sleep center that has provided sleep care to patients for many years. And it's great to have that facility in the local community for us, and that's one of those um, areas that we can take advantage of in order to evaluate patients that may have sleep disordered breathing. When it comes to other conditions, whether it's insomnia or sometimes narcolepsy, that may require some other treatment and some other diagnostic tests. But certainly sleep apnea is the most common condition that we come across and oftentimes requires further investigation.
So sleep apnea is an interesting one to think about because you said it's not necessarily when someone snores that doesn't mean it automatically is sleep apnea, but isn't that one of the main things that you might think is a problem? So what else should people be thinking about in terms of sleep apnea? Because that's the most common sleep disorder. Is that correct?
Yes, sleep apnea is by and large the most common sleep disorder we come across. Oftentimes, patients themselves will report some, sometimes they'll report some gasping for air at night, feeling like they can't breathe. Sometimes their bed partner will say, hey, you didn't, you paused in your breathing, or it seemed like you stopped breathing. Many of my patients will say, oh, my bed partner will nudge me awake because I was breathing so heavily or I was snoring so loudly. And so those symptoms, when those occur, may be some signs that needs further investigation. Sleep apnea is one of these conditions that, although in the acute moment, meaning at that point it can look scary, it actually has tremendous chronic, meaning long-term complications. And so what it can do to the heart in terms of raising your blood pressure, what it can do in the brain, raising the risk for possible strokes, what it does to diabetes, which is to worsen your diabetes, all of these other cardiovascular conditions that are associated with sleep apnea oftentimes can be worsened if sleep apnea isn't diagnosed and adequately treated.
So you mentioned the sleep lab to as a diagnostic place that you would send someone to be diagnosed with sleep apnea. But let's talk about let's say someone is actually diagnosed with it. What are some of the treatments that are available, and maybe we can talk a little bit about those.
Absolutely. So about 20, 25 years ago, there was one mainstay treatment. Actually, it was probably invented 40 or 50 years ago. And what I'm referring to is something called CPAP, which is a machine with a mask that you would wear on your face. And what it does is it provides room air. So if you remember earlier when I talked about that blockage occurring in your airway, what this machine does is it keeps that airway open. It provides pressure to keep it open. So it's not oxygen, it's just room air. And by keeping that airway open, you don't have dips in your oxygen through the course of the night. Your brain isn't being woken up all night to try to get more air. Your heart isn't working harder to deliver more blood to the body because that carries the oxygen to compensate for the dips. So the CPAP device is the mainstay that we have been using long term, and there that can be prescribed, and sometimes we do a second study to see what pressure we need for that CPAP machine. But more recently, probably in 10 or 15 years, oral appliances have made a have played a large role in treatment of sleep apnea. I sometimes refer to sleep dentists for oral appliances, which can adjust the jaw and slightly bring it forward. They're also referred to as mandibular advancement devices. And by bringing that jaw just a few millimeters forward, that can open the airway. More recently, there's been something called Inspire, which is the scientific term is a hypoglossal nerve stimulator. So that nerve is the 12th nerve that stimulates the tongue. And if you can implant a device that runs a wire to the tongue and can move the tongue forward that way. There's some indications for that as well. My mainstay, I usually use CPAP machines, particularly in patients that have severe sleep apnea, because they've been tried, they've been tested, they're true, they work well. They are readily available, and if the patient puts on weight and the severity worsens, the CPAP machines can adapt to that. The pressure can be adjusted to that. Not to take away from any other treatment options, which are newer and certainly can be more comfortable, but CPAPs have also come a long way, as well as BiPAPs, which is another type of positive airway pressure machine. They are more comfortable. The masks are more comfortable. They're less noisy. They provide adequate relief, and typically over the long run, they are what I have the most confidence in providing adequate treatment.
Right. I wanted to just ask a couple of questions that are probably on the minds of some of our audience. The first one is, are naps for adults good things or bad things for sleep and sleep patterns?
Well, it depends on who you are. I would say if you're someone who is not getting an adequate amount of sleep at night and you're taking a 2-hour nap during the day, then I wouldn't suggest it. If you're someone who is getting what is sufficient for you, but you need to take a 20-minute nap for once a week or twice a week, then I think it's reasonable. Certain patients, actually, certain narcolepsy patients, I will recommend a nap for. Now, these are patients that have certain pathology which lead to excessive daytime sleepiness, and they're unable to function because of their diagnosis, and therefore prescribing naps is a treatment modality for them. For many of us, we may not be getting enough sleep at night. We may be going to bed too late, waking up too early. And so the key is to optimize and consolidate that sleep we're getting at nighttime in the hopes that you don't need to take a nap during the day, because the daytime nap can not necessarily function with life, with day-to-day life, given the appointments. Now, I have certain patients, certain retirees who maybe go to sleep at midnight or later and wake up a little bit later. They don't have to be at an office. They don't have employment responsibilities. They may take a half-hour nap in the day. And by and large, I'm okay with that. If that's consistent with their lifestyle and it works for them, I'm okay with that.
Okay, so I know a lot of people, including myself, who will take melatonin from time to time. So that falls under the category of pharmaceuticals and other kinds of sleep aids. What's your thought on some of that?
Good point. So sleep aids are certainly something we have to be mindful of. Like anything in medicine, everything has its pluses and its minuses, and its costs and its benefits. Traditionally, there were sleep aids that were used to help patients fall asleep. May not be, some of them were not as reliable for helping patients stay asleep. More recently, there's been a big push in the heels of the opioid epidemic to avoid controlled substances. And so many of those medications are controlled substances. And so some physicians practice without them and don't prescribe them. And there are patients from 20 years ago that were using them and still continue to use them. By and large, it's obviously dependent on the patient. Now, melatonin has gained significant notoriety. You look at the shelves at a vitamin shop and they're just all over the place, or not even a vitamin. You go to your grocery store. Pretty soon I'll walk into a car dealership and there'll be melatonin there too. It's everywhere. And I do have to make an important point that not all medications created equal. And it's important to note, one, the dose, because your body produces maybe 0.1 to 0.3 milligrams of melatonin at night or on its own. Many of these have milligrams and dosages that far supersede that amount. So what's the drawback to that? One, you don't need that amount. Two, it may suppress your own pineal gland from producing its own melatonin. So taking higher doses, is not necessary. It's not necessary, and it's not necessarily better. It's not going to make you go more to sleep than the lower doses. So typically, I tell patients, find 1 milligram. Don't use it every night if you can avoid it. Pick certain nights where you may not need it. Using it consistently at a low dose, I may be comfortable with. It really depends on the patient and the use. I typically recommend avoiding higher doses. The other challenge is some formulations of it aren't FDA regulated, so we don't even know how much is in there. And I recently saw an article where they actually did analysis, and one that was marketed as having 3 milligrams actually had 9 milligrams. And so there is a IUSP a designation that it has been checked and formulated. And so to make sure that you're getting the correct dose, sometimes when it's mixed in with other ingredients and it doesn't say how much you're getting, that can be a little troubling. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a problem, but I think it's important for us to be educated consumers and to know what we're putting into our body and how much of it. So I would like our viewers to be mindful of how much whatever they're purchasing, how many milligrams, and to try to make sure that it's the right amount.
I heard that you shouldn't take it more than 2 or 3 days in a row. Is that a real thing, or is that just, you can't take it every day and just use it every day? That's what I heard.
Yeah, I advise against it. I mean, theoretically, you could. There are people that do and find it helpful. I don't, I typically advise against it for one, the reason I mentioned earlier, which is you want your body to continue to produce it, because if it feels that it's already come in from elsewhere, then it won't necessarily make it for itself. Now, that's a chronic process. That doesn't just happen over 1 or 2 or 3 nights. The other benefit of not taking it every night is then when you do want it to work, you're more likely to see it have a benefit. If you take it every night, your body may become adapted to it, have a tolerance to it, and therefore not notice as much of a benefit from it.
Right. On the other side, there's a lot of people I know who will take something like a Tylenol PM to help them go to sleep. Is that a good thing to do? Are there other things that people could be taking that are sort of pharmaceutical in nature?
I think it's all in the details. So Tylenol PM, ZQuil, all of these over-the-counter sleep aids, and there's going to be 100 more out there by the end of the year probably, because it is a market that there's a lot of interest in.
Right.
It really depends on how much is in there and what else is in there. So for my elderly patients, if I recommend this to them to not take anything that has Benadryl in it, because Benadryl can dry them out. It can have certain secondary effects that I'm concerned about, changes in mental status, urinary retention, things like that. Many people that do take Benadryl are fine with it, but I become concerned that if they are taking and it does develop, it does create a problem for them and a side effect that is an issue for them. I rather just avoid it to begin with and not have to do something about it later.
Okay. So we have a question from our audience, and it has to do with things that you can do for yourself that will help you better prepare to sleep. So exercise comes to mind. There are people who are saying candles and aromatherapy and all of this. What is your thought on that routine that people should be preparing to make it as successful as possible?
So sleep hygiene is tremendously important. First, I would say a regular bedtime and a regular waking time. Even if you're tired and waking up at 7 in the morning is tough and you had a bad night the night before, try to keep your bedtime and wake times consistent. So on the back end, if you're waking up the same time every day, then eventually your sleep drive, that we call it, should kick in, and then in the evening you should be ready to go to sleep and fall asleep and have that drive to go to sleep. And on the front end, making sure that you're going to bed at a healthy time, but not too early, such that you're laying in bed and tossing and turning. I typically recommend turning off all electronics, no berries, no apples, no phones, none of that stuff. Just keep that away. Try to keep the room in a dimly lit or dark environment, quiet, comfortable. The temperature may be important to some. Avoid fluids late at night, avoid alcohol late in the evening. Uh, be mindful of certain medications that may cause you to urinate or may cause some dry mouth, and maybe keeping mind of when to take those medications. So it is an individual experience, but there's a lot that can be done to optimize that sleep environment so that you're giving yourself the best chance to have a good sleep regimen.
Okay. And finally, there is some questions about actually visiting someone like yourself, who is a sleep specialist, and what is that consult like with you? What happens if I come to you and I have some kind of complaint about my sleeping?
So we would certainly talk about what it is that's going on, and there's different symptoms for different patients and different experiences. As we alluded to, there's insomnia and sleep apnea and narcolepsy and things like that. And we'd have to go over what your symptoms are, talk about what it is you've noticed, what your bed partner may have noticed, any daytime difficulties you may be having, and oftentimes it may require then pursuing a study, a sleep study, like we alluded to earlier, to evaluate and determine what may be occurring. Yeah.
Okay. And can you just give people a little understanding about what that sleep study process is and how that works? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation or angst almost about going in and having that study.
Certainly. So I can understand why it would be concerning, particularly in the last couple of years. It's been with hospitals dealing with infectious patients and things like that. The nice thing with St. John's, they have a separate floor for the sleep studies at night, so it's not intermixed with inpatients. There's technicians there at night, and what they do is connect a series of wires that then give us information about brain activity, eye movement, EKG, heart activity, chest movements, abdominal movements, oxygenation, leg movements. And so all of that information then gives us an understanding of what's going on for that patient's sleep, whether there's a breathing issue, whether there's excessive limb movements that may be a problem. And once all of that information is gathered, a report is generated, and we come to hopefully a diagnosis. The patient's going to stay there overnight. They're going to be there from roughly 9, 10 p.m. until 6, 7 a.m. in the morning, whenever the study's concluded. The technician will take off all the wires. At night, if they need to go to the restroom, there are restrooms there. They would just need to be disconnected. And so it's a one-night experience, and I can understand for some of us that may be a little nerve-wracking. But I will say that if it gives us a diagnosis and helps us with a treatment plan for the long term, hopefully it's tolerable. The sleep study is sort of the one in the lab. It does give us a lot of information and allows us to hopefully not only come up with a diagnosis and then have a treatment plan. The sleep studies, I do want to put a caveat in there. It's really for sleep apnea. It doesn't show us anything for insomnia. There is a certain type of sleep studies that are done for narcolepsy, but the typical overnight sleep study is really a sleep apnea study.
Okay. It's funny, I've had that test and I actually found it to be, an interesting process. But one of the things that I realized that I was in trouble was not because my husband was talking to me about my breathing so much as I was falling asleep behind the wheel. And I have a long commute. So I know that for people out there, there's a lot of people on the roads, and it's of concern that people recognize that if they're falling asleep in the car, that that's a sign that they should be out there seeking some help. So anything else that you can share with us about this process? Because I think we've covered a lot of it. Environment, diagnostics, the treatments. Anything else, doctor?
I guess I would say on the insomnia side, which seems to be more of a concern, there are psychologists who do what's called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which doesn't involve pharmaceutical. It's more of a behavioral changes that we make at night. So it's referred to as CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So I don't do much with insomnia myself, but I typically, if I have a patient, I recommend they see someone like that. And now with telehealth, um, you can see specialists all over and remotely and from home. And the cognitive behavioral therapy plan includes adjusting the bedtime, sometimes sleep restricting, meaning that you actually go to bed at a later time with the idea that your time in bed and it will be more productive and will be more sleep and be more efficient. The cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia has a multitude of treatment modalities, stimulus control, sleep hygiene, some of the things we talked about earlier. And so I highly recommend that and finding someone that does that for insomnia. And that can certainly make a big difference.
Terrific. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. We really appreciate you. We appreciate everything that you've shared with us. So thanks again. And thanks everybody out there in our audience for being with us, and look for information coming up soon. Do we have something that we're going to share with them about how they can connect with us? Is that coming? Yes. So for our audience, our virtual urgent care, Dr. Malkani was talking about telehealth. You can't do that particular on this, but we can definitely help you get to the right kind of specialists for these things. And you can call 964-4429. That's 914-964-4429 for virtual urgent care at St. John's. If you have general questions about this program or any question about anything related to St. John's, you can email us at info@riversidehealth.org. That's info@riversidehealth.org. And the phone number for the main number of the hospital is 914-964-4444. And if you need a doctor, or if you would like contact information for Dr. Malkani, feel free to email me. I will get this email as well, findadoc@riversidehealth.org, and I'll be happy to share his information with all of you in the audience. So thanks for being with us. Have a great day.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.